Standing up in McKinney. This is According to Collin, coming to you on the last day of July, the year of our Lord 2024, which also happens to coincide with my 31st anniversary to the love of my life. But you guys don't want to listen to that. The episode today is going to be, where are we? Right? You have to be able to assess where you're at in order to move forward. So we're going to spend a little time today, probably be a relatively short episode, not 40 minutes or anything, just talking about where are we at. Before we get there, let me take a moment to remind you the algorithm hates us. Social media does not work in our favor. The only thing we can do to overcome that is to like, share, subscribe, follow, join, sign up for notifications, all that stuff, right? You can join me on the social media that you're still on, which I have a page and a group at Facebook. I'm a pro at Gab, and I still drop in at MeWe. And for now, you can still find my program, at least most of it, over at YouTube. All right. I guess here we go, on with the show, right? So there's a number of different ways we can approach this. And I don't want to be negative, but I think we need to have a fair and as objective assessment as we can to establish our baseline where we're at, so that when we continue to talk about where do we want to go and what are we looking to accomplish, and particularly when I make the next episode for Friday, we need to already have this figured out. Okay, so I'm going to just start local, right? We'll work our way up. I don't know that I want to spend any time significantly on city politics. I will say, and I've spent some time talking about this before, I believe the vast majority of voters in Collin County are in fact Republican voters. And I believe the vast majority of said Republican voters in Collin County are center-right. What that means is they're not necessarily motivated by ideological purity. They're not necessarily motivated by extreme positions. They're motivated by things are pretty nice. We'd like to keep them nice. And what do we need to do to keep them nice? And are you a nice guy or a nice lady running for office that is going to do nice things for us? So we are surrounded by nice because we live in a bubble of good things, right? Collin County has been good for a very long time, and things are generally really good here. And they're good here compared to even the state of Texas, and Texas on the whole is good compared to the rest of the United States, and the rest of the United States is good on the whole compared to the entire world. So when you look at the bubble that we live in that makes up Collin County, things are pretty darn nice. But in that niceness, in that bubble, there's been a whole lot of things festering under the surface that we haven't dealt with, and we don't observe, and we don't deal with. And when we do deal with it, quite frankly, some of us maybe overreact. Some of us probably dramatize the situation more than absolutely necessary. And I got to be honest, there are certain issues that do make my blood boil. I mean, the fact that we would defend adult trannies going to a restroom with little kids, that just floors me. The fact that we tolerate it. But that's another issue, and we'll touch on that later. There are other things that it's just beyond me. And I mean, I'm all for not being rude and not being mean. But you also have to be able to stand on principle, and you have to be able to articulate what do you believe and why do you believe it. And I think that's some of the failures that we see. So as we deal with this, I would also remind you this stuff wouldn't be happening if we would have dealt with it years ago. This stuff wouldn't be happening if we did a better job. Okay? Now, I think that a lot of people think politics is downstream of culture, and then other people think that politics changes culture. I think it's both. Both press against each other. One of the biggest problems we have is that we've tolerated so many things for so long under the guise of an apolitical church, under the guise of always being nice, under the guise of not wanting to be offensive. We've allowed for the very things that are undermining us now to grow up from nothing because we tolerated it. We wanted to be inclusive. We wanted to be fair. And now that we saw what grew up out of that, we're repulsed by it, and naturally and appropriately, but we don't do it well. And I don't know at this point that there is a good way to do it. I don't know that there's a good way to push back against adults that want to manipulate and abuse and permanently scar children. I don't know how you deal with that. I mean, for me, it's conceptually easy to understand why back in the day, certain guys got their legs readjusted. I can understand why in certain cultures, if you do something to a kid, you don't walk out of that room. I see some value to that, particularly when the entirety of our legal system is about defending and protecting people that are predators. And that's what you call any adult that would prey on a child or an innocent young person. The corollary to that, or the secondary issue of that, is young people have started to do that to themselves. And I think that's all built upon the concept that life doesn't have a value. We haven't assessed an inherent value on life as a culture for over 50 years. Maybe it's longer. I had a conversation with a friend of mine earlier today. We were talking about, 1962 Roe versus Wade, decision and opinion by the Supreme Court. I opined that I didn't think it would stand if the culture was really against it. I don't think they would have done that opinion had they felt like the culture would have, fought back or made a difference. Honestly, I think some of the guys in black robes do legitimately fear for their lives, and it causes them to not make the right decision. I'm not saying that that's appropriate, and I'm not saying that's ideal, but just perhaps conceptually, if some of those guys feared those consequences back in 1962, they may not have done what they did. Again, it's because they don't fear we the people. It's because they don't fear Christians, because they don't fear conservatives, that they continuously push and push and push and push. They would never, and when I say they, I just mean generally, the government would never make a move against a Muslim church. And you got to ask yourself why that might be. And again, I'm not justifying the action. I'm not saying that it's right. I'm just saying that there's a proper respect and fear of the people, which is why they don't press their luck. I suspect that back in 1776 or 1767 or 1789, that's exactly how our government felt. They knew they couldn't get away with certain things, so they buried what they were doing, or they hid it, or they manipulated it so that they could sell something, right? That's just my thought. So I've gone way off where I wanted to be, but I want to explain this in the context of right here in Collin County, right here in the city that I live in. There are a whole lot of people that want to turn a blind eye and just think that we're in a great place. And we are. In all of history and all of time, we're in a fantastic place, in a fantastic geography, and everything is wonderful. So now, someday it may not be. That someday may be sooner rather than later. And you can blame that on education, socialism, demographics, inertia, entropy, whatever you want to blame it on. Sooner or later, all good things must come to an end is, the old adage that we used to hear. So I suspect that as Collin County is successful, more people will move here. And as more people move here, we have more free riders. And more free riders typically changes the outcome of what happens. Remember, once upon a time, Detroit was a thriving metropolis and the envy of the country. Now, some people would ascribe the failure to a racial aspect. I wouldn't do that. I don't think it's fair. I think it maybe correlates, but it doesn't necessarily cause, right? Just because you have correlation doesn't mean you have causation. I think the causation maybe brought along some correlation, but that's a different story. You can see the same thing played out in Houston and to a lesser extent Dallas, in my opinion. Now, what does that look for us going forward, right? That's the real question here. So Collin County currently has 3 cities north of 200,000 and a fourth one that's north of 100,000. We've got 1.2 million people here. We've been successful. We've been, quite frankly, the envy of many counties/nations. How do we perpetuate that? How do we continue to do that? Now, I know that there are a number of local officials or developers that they are not concerned about 10 or 20 years from now. They're concerned about how do they line their pocket now. And figuring that they can just move to the next wonderful spot or the next place they can make some more money. I don't know how we fix that. I like to believe that generational thought process. I like to think that people that are rooted and established in a location will be more wise on how they develop and build things out. But oftentimes we get lost in this idea that we're going to make money, we're going to be able to cash in. I think about several of the large, family ranches or farms in the area, and they made oodles of money by being able to save or sell it out in parcels to developers over time. And they've created generational wealth for themselves. And quite frankly, most of us wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that. And it's been nice. But most of the time, they were well thought out developments with single family homes and, certain amenities that would cause people to want to move here. I saw something over the weekend with a little brief snippet on the Texas pool down in Plano. I mean, I knew vaguely that it was there and it looks pretty awesome, but that aerial shot just showed me how large it is and how cool it looks from the air. I had no idea. And those kinds of things, were an attractive thing 40 or 50 years ago. I wonder if they are now. I look at the community I live in and in the changes that have developed in, less than 30 years. We went from a semi-rural, ex-urban community that had a downtown area that was kind of sleepy, and we're now a large, expansive suburb with, I guess, at least 2 or 3 little city core areas. We're developing at a rapid pace. We're getting to be very high density in certain areas, and we're looking at how do we properly take care of this and develop this long term. And I think at this point, the long-term residents, right, the people that have roots in the area are probably looking around and saying, we never signed up for this. This isn't what we value or what we desired when we started this project. Meanwhile, the early adopters, right, myself, I've been here 27 years in McKinney. I'm thinking to myself, this is kind of cool, but at what point do we say enough? I mean, development's nice, but it has to be wisely thought out and consider the consequences. Because if you change everything about what it is you came here for, at a certain point you lost what brought you there in the first place. Now, so this is where I'm going to make the pivot, right? So if you look at Texas as a whole, Texas is ideally better than pretty much every other state out there in many ways. And you can ticky-tack certain things and say, well, maybe this state's slightly better overall, or this state's got an edge on this or that. But by and large, people come to Texas because they want to be part of Texas. They want to take part of the quote-unquote Texas miracle. But again, if you flood your state, which I guess nearly 30 years ago, the state of Texas had, 15, 18 million people? We're double that now. And how many of those people that have come here are actually Texan or want to be Texan? And at what point does Texas seem to be Texas when it's populated by non-Texans? That's the deeper question, right? And when you look at it at a smaller level, at what point does McKinney cease to be McKinney, or Plano cease to be Plano, or Allen cease to be Plano? Or I'm sorry, Allen, excuse me, Freudian slip there. They change, they adapt over time, and it can still maintain some of the culture and the feel of the original version. But as time goes on, things do change. It's natural. It's appropriate. But if you upend and redo things, it's not exactly the same. In fact, it becomes something entirely different. So if we infuse McKinney now with 200,000 new people, well, let's be generous, 180,000 new people that were never here before, and they bring all their baggage and all their stuff with them, is McKinney still the McKinney that it was? Well, no, of course not. But is it still a good place to go? Is it a place that people desire to be? I would tell you yes. I mean, I'm here because I like it, and I don't want to go somewhere else. Are there things I'm not entirely thrilled about? Sure. But the same could be said about anything, anywhere, at all times. So why does this matter? Because as much as we like to say politics doesn't matter, as much as some people would like to say, I don't follow politics, I don't care about politics, the fact of the matter is politics cares about you. Politics affects everything that you do on this earth. So if you're going to completely disengage or just coast on the idea that, well, Texas is bright red and Collin County is red and it's going to always be that way and it's a great place to be and I'm just going to be able to continue to coast and enjoy life, I'm here to tell you that's not the case. I mean, we're still maybe 58% Republican. I would say most of them are center-right Republican, and that's okay insofar as the grand scheme of things. But you're not going to accomplish things. You're not going to build things. You're not going to make a difference if you're just going along to get along. But we need to inspire people and draw people and make them see that there's a benefit for doing certain things. And right now we don't do that either. So where we are is we're kind of in a lethargic funk, right? The complacency that was bred by success, and we're not paying attention to what's going on around us, particularly in Texas as a whole. So as we've continued to fill up Texas with non-Texans, and they continue to bring all their Yankee stuff with them, Texas has changed. Texas is morphed. Now, some of it maybe is good. I, for one, am thankful that we have In-N-Out Burger. I, for one, am thankful that we get Culver's here. But I'm not necessarily in favor of everything else that has come along with it. I don't think it's been a net positive that I've got, a liquor store every quarter mile now in town. I mean, that's not how they sold it to us when they legalized it in McKinney, but that's what we got. I don't think it's the end of the world either. I've been, in Plano for almost the entire time that I've lived here. I've been going down into Plano, and they have liquor stores too, and their city's still plenty nice. It's a natural cycle, right? But is it the same? No. Is it going to always be the same? No. But you have to have an acceptance for change, but you also want to determine what that change is. Is it a positive change? And I would suggest to you that this is where we've really failed. So when we're evaluating where we're at, best case scenario, we're center right. Best case scenario, we're still wallowing in this complacency, right? This idea that things are really nice and they're going to always be nice, and that's deceptive. In long term, it's going to be a mistake because sooner or later, the leftist progressive socialists are going to get their way. They're going to pollute the minds of enough young people to make them hate America, hate the United States as we know it, hate Texas, hate white people, hate males, hate everybody that isn't whatever wins the Olympics of... I'm not going to go there. Just so where we're at is we're in a really tenuous position. So I'm going to tell you, it's very tempting to lash out. It's very tempting to just run around, call names, get abusive, and be mean and fight back because all that matters is right now. Yes, that's maybe true. And if you only think in terms of defense, sure. But I wanted to encourage you that there are ways around this. There are more children being homeschooled now than ever before. There are more children being put in private, non-government schools than any time in the past. Well, I should say recent past, because prior to the early 1800s, all school was private school, at least in the United States. I shouldn't say all. Most all school. The idea is there are other options. There are other ways to go forward. And I got to be honest, I think a good chunk of the people moving to Texas have an idealized version of Texas and actually do want to be like that. So the question is how do we do that? How do we inspire them? How do we encourage them? We're going to spend a little time on that in a minute. So this is where we accept that Texas is the anchor, the largest red state in these United States, the state without which these United States would become a socialist hellhole. I mean, let's just face it. That's what happens without Texas. And it may still happen. And it won't be because they outproduce us, and it won't be because they have new and exciting ideas. They're just flooding us with people that align with their goals and, quite frankly, warping a majority of the young people. And we stand by and accept it because we think things are so great in Collin County, so great in Texas, that we don't need to be worried about it. And when we look at our fellow quote-unquote red states, I'm looking at Oklahoma, I'm looking at Idaho, they have the same problem that we do here in Texas, right? Everybody's a Republican. Everybody's red. And by red, we mean Republican red, not commie red. I'm not sure when that change happened, but here we are. But if everybody's a good Republican, how do we get these socialist policies? How do we get these moderate milquetoast elected officials that sell us down to the Democrat opponents all the time? That's the challenge, right? We've allowed that Overton window to be marched consistently to the left. In fact, the problem is so pervasive that I'm going to give you a few examples as to how and why this happened. You have people that argue that they're exercising their First Amendment rights and you can't tell them to stop in a private meeting. That's not what the First Amendment means, and that's not who the First Amendment is bound by, or I should say, and that's not what the First Amendment binds. The First Amendment binds the federal government. Now, perhaps in the state of Texas, we have a similar amendment in the Texas Constitution that doesn't allow for the Texas state organization to prevent you from speaking or from being heard or for freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, the press, right? There's the 5 basic freedoms ensured protection in the First Amendment. But that's only really binding to the federal government. And even if you believe the myth that is incorporation, that binds the states. It doesn't bind private corporations. It doesn't bind public corporations. It doesn't bind private clubs from telling you can't speak. And even when it does bind government organizations, it binds them in such a way that they can't stop you from speaking entirely, but they can put time and place restrictions on you. And the law is really only applicable when dealing with government institutions. So that when you have the same group of people that advocate that they have a right to free speech, and you have to listen to them in a private organizational meeting, 1, they're claiming the wrong right, and 2, they're ignoring the right of a private organization to determine how and when they get to speak. And secondarily, if you're a private organization, you're not necessarily held by those laws. It is a rule. Again, it gets lost. Now, it could be as simple as they don't know the right terminology, or it could be as simple as they're deviously looking to undermine everything. I don't know. But if you can't keep these things straight, if you can't understand conceptually that a private organization can have different rules and different ways of doing things than a government can, that's where we lost. And it's bad enough now that we're willing to accept private organizations, i.e. social media platforms, restricting, stripping, and preventing transmission of ideas and thoughts because they don't agree with them or the government doesn't agree with them because it's a private organization doing it on behest of government. Somehow it's okay. Somehow this passes muster, even though they're doing it. Now, some of these organizations do curtail this free speech under duress. And some do it willingly, and some just look for any way they can get away with doing it. But that's largely on us, we the people. So the question is, what are you going to do about it? Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to understand how things actually work. You have to understand if an organization is run by rules or law, and if law is binding in this situation or not. And then you have to understand common courtesy. And then you have to understand, well, I joined a private organization, or I'm a part of a private corporation, and they're doing things that violate the conscience. So that means I have to either change the organization or advocate to change this private company from the way they do things. And I'll tell you, generally you're not successful when you disrupt and prevent anybody else from speaking or from any other business being done. But again, if you can't comprehend that and you won't apply that, we're going to waste an enormous amount of time. So when I look at the things that are playing out in Collin County, when the things that are playing out in Texas, and we can't keep our own stuff together, and we can't focus our energies on the proper things, I worry. I worry because we're conflating things here. We're conflating a real threat to an inconvenience. In my mind, there are any number of real threats, both to the state of Texas, to a future Republic of Texas, and these United States, that are ignored, dismissed, passed off, because those in power have a vested interest in those things coming to pass. And we, the people, are left in the dust. We, the people, don't have a word. We, the people, can't act unified because we're so worried about some minor contradiction or minor difference. Sometimes you have to be willing to say, hey, there's a giant threat over there. The guy on my right or the guy on my left isn't necessarily my favorite person, but we both agree there's a giant threat over there. Let's go deal with that giant threat over there. And that's a challenge, right? Because we have the complacent, lackadaisical attitude in Collin County and to an extent here in Texas, and we can't even get our people excited and motivated to push back and fight for the things that they believe in because they're too busy arguing about minor issues. They're not focused on the real threat, the real enemy, if you will. So conceptually, when we look at these United States, we have to also come to the understanding that our federal government, that the people on the Potomac, they don't want our feedback. They're not interested in what we have to say. They propose that we're all Americans. That we're all Americans because you're here on the magic soil, and as Americans, you must do what we say. Yeah, those little pesky freedom things, well, they don't really matter because they're inconvenient to us. We're the government. We know what's best for you. And yet we don't have a unified front to this. We don't have a good, valid response to this. We don't have an articulate way to push back on this and make a difference. Now, you would think that if you came to Collin County in Texas, you would see that we have a massive army of people willing and able to take the battle to wherever it needs to be, to go argue and articulate for our rights and our freedoms and why they matter and who we're taking this out on, who the enemy is, what the enemies are, and what they're trying to do. And to a part, we do. We do have people doing that. But they're underfunded, they're underutilized, and quite frankly, they're dismissed by a lot of our own leadership. There is a disconnect between leadership at the state level, or certainly the federal level, from the grassroots and from the county level people. There's certainly some angst about some of the things that go on at the different levels of leadership. And I'm not just talking about political parties. I'm talking about anything. Corporate ladders, government entities. That's just the way it is. It's natural. You have to understand what we're dealing with. And once you understand that, then you find the way to work forward. You find the way to push back. You find a way to become effective. And you don't get upset when that person differentiates themselves by 2 or 3 minor issues, but they're still on your team. They're still fighting for the same thing you're fighting with. No, shake yourself out of the complacency and don't depend on that one person or those 2 people to go fight the fight for you. My fear is that we've had it so good for so long, and we've watched everything erode slowly, and we haven't even really noticed. And now that we're getting people excited and worried and motivated, they're busy fighting about the very people that have been trying to tell them about this all along. They're going after the wrong stuff. The communists, the socialists, the leftists, the progressives, the whatever you want to call them, they're eating this up. We're playing right into their hands. Yeah, look, I know there's some milquetoast people, particularly a lot of them that are elected representatives, and they don't give us everything we want. And I know that they need probably their butts kicked and their hands held on certain issues from time to time. I get it. But respectfully, they're not the problem if they're not selling us out. If they're selling us out, the reason why they're selling us out is because they know we're not going to do anything about it. They know there's no cost or consequence to them. Go back to my original statement, or my opening statement. If those in charge actually feared the people that they're leading, they would behave entirely different. Now, understand what I'm saying there. I am not advocating that we take any measures that would leave people harmed physically. What I am suggesting is there should be a healthy and natural fear of any elected official that purportedly represents you if they're doing things that work against the majority of the people that put them there in the first place. But because there's no fear, this is where we're at. Indeed, when we fight amongst ourselves, those that are in office continue to ignore us. They have no fear. And if you think it's bad in Collin County or even the state of Texas, look at these United States, our national government, what they do, and how they have callous disregard for we the people, for all those people in the flyover country. Now just magnify that times 500 when you're dealing with the world. We don't even have enough time to get into the world. Let's just focus back to the relationship between the county to the state to the nation. Focus on the battles that matter. Focus on the battles that you can win. Take the wins that you get and leverage them for the next thing down the road. Keep your allies close, some of your enemies closer. Know which is which, and continue to think about the future. Continue to focus about how do we get there. And then you'll have a pretty good idea where we're at. And with that, this has been According to Callus. And I will see you on the other side.
For all your Texas fashion tees, it's TexianPride.com. Whether you're out honky-tonkin' in Austin, bucking Broncos in Fort Worth, or strolling the San Antonio Riverwalk, Texian Pride is here for you. Support a Texan-owned business and show off your love for Texas with style. Visit TexianPride.com for your next fashionable Texas tee.